change the view. Okay, so chapter 9. Hear, O Israel, this is Shema Yisrael, which is the way Moses tends to address the people. That Shema is, listen up, pay attention. What I'm telling you is important. You're about to cross the Jordan and go and dispossess nations greater and more populous than you, great cities with walls sky high, right? So Moses is making it clear that the task ahead of them is going to be very difficult, the conquest of the land of Israel. And this idea of walled cities, of course, makes it much more difficult. And here he's emphasizing the walls are very tall. And then a people great and tall, the Anakites, of whom you have knowledge, because you've heard it said, who can stand to the children of Anak? So we've heard about these before. It actually, you can go all the way back to the beginning of Genesis, and we have a description of very tall people, big. The sense is that they're going to overwhelm and overpower you. When the scouts go in, when they're sent in the book of Numbers to spy out the land and come back with information, one of the things they do is to describe the size of some of the people in the land. And they say, to them, we seemed as grasshoppers. It gives you a sense. It also gives you a sense of their fear. Know this day that none other than the Lord your God is crossing at your head. Right? So who is the vanguard? Who will be going ahead of everyone? It's God. So this is God's battle. You have to do your part. God will do his part. And then we get this expression for God, a devouring fire. The Hebrew is Eish Ochla. Ochla means to eat, right? A fire that eats. It's an interesting expression and an evocative one. And there's a wonderful midrash about it. And the midrash says that we should walk in God's ways, a quote from the Torah. And the rabbis ask, how can you be close to God, literally walk the way God walks, if God is a devouring fire? How can we get close to God? We'll perish. And this is similar to the idea that the people had to stay at the base of Sinai when the Torah is given, lest they be harmed. Right? There is a sense getting too close to God is dangerous. So the rabbis say, how can we do that? God is a devouring fire. What does it mean? And the answer they give is that we do it by imitating God. What God does, we do. Now, for Christians, of course, who also, they ask themselves, what would Jesus do, and so on, that's relatively easy, right? You can look into the Christian Bible, the so-called New Testament, and Jesus does a lot of stuff. And you can say, okay, this is how Jesus behaves, and this is how I should behave. But we don't have that. Right? We don't have an image of God walking among us doing things. And so the rabbis point to several things that God does. It's not often that we're told how God acts, but the first case they mention is in the Garden of Eden. Once Adam and Eve have eaten from the tree and they realize that they are naked, and God expels them from the garden, it says that God makes clothing, which is really quite nice. And from that, we are to learn, just as God clothes the naked, we too should clothe the naked. Second example is that Abraham, sitting by the tent, by his tent, God has he's speaking to God, right? And eventually these three angels come, and it's unclear whether God is the angel or they represent him. But anyway, the rabbis point to the fact that this takes place immediately after Abraham's circumcision. So they say, what is God doing?
Enjoy all this cuteness all day long. You're so lucky.
All right, somebody is unmuted, and I ask you to please mute. God comes to Abraham, and if you look at the sequence in the Torah, it's immediately after the circumcision. And therefore, just as God visits the sick and cares for them, so too we should visit the sick. And then the final example is Moses at the end of his life, who dies. We'll see that eventually, and God buries him. There's no one else. He's at the top of a mountain. He's looked out over the promised land, and God buries him. So just as God takes care of people when they die, so we too should take care of them. In other words, all of this is about kindness, right? It's about helping people who are in difficult circumstances. So despite the fact that God is Eish Ochla, a devouring fire, it is possible, in fact, to imitate God, to come close to God in that particular way. Okay, but here Moses is talking about God who will fight for the people. And the idea of him being a devouring fire, of course, which the Midrash takes out of context, here is talking about how he will be able to go before you and wipe them out. He will subdue them for you. You may quickly dispossess and destroy them as the Lord has promised you. And when the Lord your God has thrust them from your path, do not say to yourself, the Lord has enabled us to possess this land because of our virtues. It is not that God is giving this to us because we are so good. In fact, it's rather because of the wickedness of the nations that the Lord is dispossessing them from you. It is not because of your virtues and your rectitude that you're able to possess their country. It is because that the Lord your God is dispossessing these nations before you in order to fulfill the oath that the Lord made to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it's a really fascinating statement because it actually has implications for later Jewish history. I want to go back for just a minute, though, to the first time that this appears, this idea that the people of the land of Israel, of Canaan, will be dispossessed only because of their ways, of their wickedness. So I'm going to look back. You can turn to it if you want, to Genesis, looking back to page 84. Hold where you are, and if you want to go back to 84, here we have the scene where God has promised Abraham the land. And Abraham says to him, I'm at the top of page 84, O Lord our God, how shall I know that I am to possess it? Thank you for promising it to me, but I need something more tangible. And what does God do? He tells him to do a particular ritual, that he should bring a heifer, a 3-year-old she-goat, a 2-year-old ram, a turtle dove, a young bird. And these animals are cut and they are put on two sides of a path. Birds of prey are coming down, but Abraham drives them away. And as the sun is about to set, a deep sleep falls over Abram, and a great dark dread depends on him. And God says, know well that your offspring will be strangers in a land not theirs, and they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. There are other texts, of course, after the fact, which seem to limit it. I will execute judgment on the nation they will serve, and in the end, they will go out with great wealth. You, Abraham, will die in peace, and then your descendants will return here in the fourth generation. Why? The iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. In other words, I am giving you this land, but I can't take it away from them because they have not yet behaved in such a way that I can legitimately take it away from them, right? So this idea is, yes, God's promising the land to Abraham and therefore to his descendants, and that is what Moses is referencing. But just because God wants to give it to them, actually God is constrained because God needs to wait because God is just and he can't take it away from the inhabitants until they have given up in some ways their right to it by their bad behavior. And so Abraham, even though, God says, I'm giving it to you, actually, Abraham, you're going to have to. So this is really tied to the notion that this is a holy land, right? A land that cannot tolerate immorality and injustice, and will expel the people from it who behave that way.
Can you bring the
So the essential notion here is, I think, and the prophets pick this up later on. If the Israelites do what the Canaanites did, they too will be expelled from the land, right? In other words, the land is actually the promise by Abraham to the people. The land is actually conditional. That is to say, they have to behave in a way that they're entitled to it. And if they cease to, they will be exiled. And that's what the prophets reinforce. And that's indeed what happens, whereas the prophets are riling against the people, both because they practice idolatry and also because of the way they treat poor and other things. And therefore, the Babylonians come, they are conquered and they are exiled and then eventually get to return. And the Romans again conquer it and so on. So land is conditional. So I want to, at this point, just stop for a minute and ask for questions or comments before I go on. Yeah, Sandy.
So, Rabbi, I have a different book. You said page 84. Could you please tell me the chapter and verse?
Oh, sure. I'm sorry. I seem to have, yeah. Yeah, you'll find it. It's Genesis chapter 15. And it really, you could even go back to the beginning of the chapter. And you'll
15.
see. Yeah, beginning of chapter.
Thank you. Thank you.
Other questions? Barry.
So in the story of the Exodus, God hardens the heart of Pharaoh.
Yes.
That says, is there any notion of God bringing about the immorality of the Amorites?
No. I mean, God hardens Pharaoh's heart. Very relevant, of course, to Pesach, which is coming, right? For a variety of reasons. God is not just interested in getting the people out of Egypt, right? That would be relatively easy to do. Why do we need all these plagues? Why does Pharaoh become resistant? The idea, and I want to say one thing about hardening Pharaoh's heart. I would say that what God is giving Pharaoh is the courage of his conviction. That is to say that Pharaoh is naturally frightened, and God takes away that fear so that Pharaoh will do what Pharaoh would naturally do. So why is that? Well, because God is interested, I think, if you read the text carefully, in three things. The first is to end the suffering of the Jewish people and to bring them out of Egypt. The second is to demonstrate God's supreme power. And we're going to see an expression of that here too, that God is the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings, that God is the most powerful being in the universe. And if you look at the plagues carefully, you will see that each of them actually is a plague against one of the gods of the Egyptians. So just to give you a couple of examples, well, actually the last example is perhaps the best, right? The plague of darkness is against essentially the sun, who was worshipped by the Egyptians as a god. The blood at the beginning, right, is in the Nile, also worshipped by the Egyptians as a god. And you can go through and you can see references in each of the plague to one of the deities of Egypt. So part of that is that. And then, interestingly enough, one of the main purposes of the Exodus, and we're coming up to it in a few weeks, is so that the Israelites will pass on to their children and their children through the generations the memory of the Exodus. That it needs to be done in such a way that it's truly memorable. All of the signs and wonders, etc., the very things we talk about on Pesach. Several times when your children ask, you should tell them, right? All of that seems to be intrinsic to the purpose for the Exodus. Great. Any other questions or comments before we go on? Okay. Let me switch the view again. Okay. So we are back here. We're in verse 6, page 1043. Know it is that it is not for any virtue of yours that the land is giving you this land. For you are a stiff-necked people. Right? Sure, and that expression, is a really interesting one. What does it mean to be stiff-necked? Right? What is the Bible? The Bible uses this metaphor. It seems to have something sort of willful, disregarding other circumstances. You can only look in one direction, right? Stubborn, right? Set in your ways despite everything, right? So the people are referred to as stiff-necked. Now, remember never to forget, right? This is a memory that you must maintain with you, which is a consequence of your stiff-neckedness, how you provoked the Lord your God to anger in the wilderness. From the day that you left the land of Egypt until you reached this place, you have continued defiant towards the Lord. And now at Horeb, which is Sinai, you so provoked the Lord that the Lord was angry enough to have you destroyed. Right? What happened there? We're going to see it's the golden calf. So as Moses has done before, earlier in the book, where Moses went through and recounted several incidents of Jewish history, Moses is now coming to what in some ways is the worst sin of all. Okay. So I had ascended the mountain to receive the tablets of stone, the tablets of the covenant which the Lord had made with you. I stayed on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, eating no bread and drinking no water. The Hebrew is somewhat poetic. Moses says, I was there, Arba'im Yom, Arba'im Laila, 40 days and 40 nights. Lechem lo achalti umayim lo shatiti. Bread I did not eat. Water I did not drink. The Lord gave me 2 tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of God. Here it is God who does it. The exact words that the Lord the Lord had addressed to you on the mountain, out of the fire, on the day of assembly. That is the day that they all gathered there. And at the end of these 40 days and 40 nights, the Lord gave me the 2 tablets of stone, the tablets of the covenant. These are Luchot Habrit, the tablets of the covenant. All right, so Moses now has the tablets. And what we have here is God says to him, hurry down, go down from here at once, for the Lord, for the people who you brought out of Egypt have acted wickedly. They've been quick to stray from the path that I enjoined upon them and have made themselves a molten image. So notice the language, the people that you brought out of Egypt. Everywhere else, we're talking, God says the people I brought out of Egypt. Think about the Passover Seder for a minute. Not by an angel, not by a messenger, the Lord himself, right? Here God is saying, you brought them out, right? God is in some sense saying the way they behave, they're your people and not mine. That's the implication. And in fact, if you look back into the book of Exodus, what God says is God is going to wipe them out. And he says to Moses, and I will make a new people from you. Right? You'll be the new Abraham. Right. So here, God, it's not quite as detailed, but God is disavowing. And he says they've been wicked, they've made themselves a molten image. Okay, so what exactly, and it's not here referred to as a calf, but we know that, right? So actually did they create a god, right? Or did they do something else? Is the calf to be worshipped as another god, or does it become a kind of tangible form for which they can worship their God, the God of Israel, right? And the consensus of most scholars is that it is the latter rather than the former, right? This is idolatry in the sense that they made an idol, even though that idol is the idol of the God who took them out of Egypt. You could read it either way, but that seems to be the way it's read. And the idea here is that it is a kind of throne that God will come down upon. Interestingly enough, when we get to the creation of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, which we've read about for a few weeks now in synagogue, in the book of Exodus, right? So the tabernacle itself, and if you come to the ark, and above the ark, you have these 2 cruvim, cherubs, and they face each other. That is understood to be a throne on which God dwells. Later on in the book of Ezekiel at the beginning of the book talks about an image of God's chariot with various forms, part animal, part human, that are bearing this chariot. So what they do here is they create something which in itself would not be sinful. At least they're trying to do something. But they worship it. They treat it as an idol, and they already know, even though they don't have the tablets, they already know it's forbidden because they heard the command. And in the 10 commandments, as you know, we just looked at it not long ago, one of them is not making graven images. And in fact, they begin to cavort around it and talk about it in a way, and actually have a kind of orgy around it, which goes far further than simply having an image which, in some ways will support God. So anyway, it's not described here, but how does Moses respond? First, the Lord says to him, I see that this is a stiff-necked people. Again, leave me alone, and I will destroy them and blot their name out from under heaven. I will make you a nation far more numerous than they. Yeah, so it is here, right? You'll be the new Abraham. But it's interesting what God says to Abraham. Leave me alone, and I'll do this. And if you think about it, inherent in what God is saying is, you can stop me. Right? When you say, leave me alone, what it means is, if you intercede, it's not necessarily going to go the way I'm planning for it to go. So don't intercede. At least that's how the rabbinic tradition understands it. God is deliberately giving Moses an opening, right? And from that sort of reading, God doesn't really want to destroy. And he's inviting Moses to plead their case. And this is, we often think about the prophet as someone who speaks to the people in God's name. But a prophet, and Moses here is the quintessential prophet, also speaks for the people to God. And here God is saying, okay, in some sense, God is saying, make the case. So Moses, and Moses will, but for now, I started down the mountain ablaze with fire, the 2 tablets of the covenant in my hands. I saw how you had sinned against the Lord your God, how you had made yourselves a molten calf. And now Moses sees what it is. You had been quick to stray from the path that the Lord had enjoined. And therefore, I gripped the 2 tablets and flung them away with both my hands, smashing them before your eyes. So we had just been told, if you look back a few verses, that God, I'm looking back to verse 10, the Lord gave me 2 tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of the Lord. Right? God made these tablets. This is God's handiwork. They are therefore the most sacred objects in the world. What else do we have? I mean, yeah, the whole world in some sense. Look back to Genesis as God's creation. But beyond that, these tablets, now what does Moses do? He smashes them. He shatters them. And in a certain sense, at least from the point of view of the rabbis and the Midrash, that's somewhat problematic, right? So there's a wonderful Midrash, which what's really sacred about the tablet? It's the writing. So the Midrash says, and there's no evidence from here, the Midrash says, well, actually the tablets were extremely heavy. In fact, way too heavy for Moses to carry these big stone tablets, right? Imagine them, more like the size of a monument, gravestone, something really large. So how is he able to do it? It's the writing, right? The writing itself is somehow carrying them, right? When the writing sees what the people are doing, the writing flies off to heaven, and Moses drops the tablets. Now, it's a lovely explanation, except that the Torah here says, right, I grabbed them, and I threw them. Right? So the Midrash is trying to ease over it, but this seems to be a willful act. Now, there are 2 ways to look at this. The tablets are actually the tablets of the covenant, right? They have the text of the covenant, in a sense, inscribed on. The Israelites have broken the covenant. They have violated the commandment, and therefore, in some sense, the covenant is no longer in effect. And Moses is symbolizing that by smashing it. Another possibility, and that is, if if the people are cavorting around an idol because they've made this thing and are treating it as sacred, even if it doesn't represent another god, what will the people do with these tablets? And the possibility is they'll worship them. And even more so because they're written, as it were, with the finger of God. And so here too, Moses smashes them lest they become objects of idolatry themselves. All right. And then he says, I threw myself down before the Lord, eating no bread, drinking no water, 40 days and 40 nights as before. Right? What's the purpose? Because of the great wrong you had committed doing what displeased the Lord. So Moses is now fasting. It's a penitential fast. We didn't see that idea in Exodus. And the purpose is to show, to express on the behalf of the people a certain contrition. When we've committed a sin, one way to show the seriousness of our desire to repent is to fast. We see that most clearly on Yom Kippur. There's another level to it also. This idea that Moses did not eat, that it's also a kind of self-purification, right? What beings are there that do not eat and drink? It's the angels, right? It's trying to rise to the level of perfection of these heavenly beings. And then he goes on to say, I was in dread of the Lord's fierce anger against you, which moved him to wipe you out. And at that time, too, the Lord gave heed to me. Moreover, the Lord was angry enough with Aaron to have destroyed him. So I also interceded with Aaron at that time. So we didn't see this in Exodus at all. This is a new idea. In Exodus, we don't have a sense that Aaron pays a price. Aaron is instrumental in making this calf. Remember, the people come to him and they say, Moses is gone, we need something. And Aaron tells them, well, bring me your gold and silver. And he throws them into the fire and the calf comes. So he's the one who does it. Right? Now, Aaron, maybe the rabbis tried to say, well, he was trying to stall them, right? He himself says, well, the calf came out, right? He didn't intend it to be worshipped, just as Moses is not worshipped. The calf is there in some sense to lead them, just as Moses led them. But he's the one who does it. And so now we get a sense, well, actually, God wanted to wipe him out. But just as Moses interceded and prayed, for the people, here he's specifically praying for Aaron. And we see this also in another scene, right, where Miriam, Moses' sister, is struck with this scale disease, often called leprosy, and Moses prays for her, right, and she is healed. So this idea of Moses as the intercessor, we see here too. And then what does he do? As for the sinful thing that you had made, the calf, I took it and put it in the fire. I broke it into bits and ground it thoroughly until it was fine dust. I threw the dust into the brook, which comes down from the mountain. Well, Exodus is a little bit different because not only does Moses grind it, he actually makes the people drink it, which looks a lot like the test that is given to a woman accused of adultery, right, in the book of Numbers. Be that as it may, he throws it into the brook, right, as if to say, the sin itself has been destroyed and now washed away, symbolically. And I just want to make note of the fact that there is a Jewish custom, not exactly this, but a little bit like this, which is called tashlich, right? Where we cast off our sins into a body of water, which is generally done on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. So you could say that Moses is somehow initiating tashlich here. Okay, I'm going to stop because we've really covered a great deal at this point. And let me open up the view. Okay, questions, comments, anything at all? Yeah, Hannah.
Yeah, it just is so obvious you can't fast in that desert for 40 days and not have water.
Yes.
Like, totally impossible.
Or frankly, food. You know, where you
Especially the
can
water
die
in
of,
that heat. In that
you
heat.
die of thirst first, right? No, the idea is that Moses has now ascended to a certain place where he's in some sense like the angels. And we see this. There's a scene where Moses, when he comes down from the mountain, his face is shining. Right? He's been somehow transformed. And in fact, it's too much for the people. And from that point on, he wears a kerchief over his face, a kind of veil, in order to cover over his shining face, except when he goes to communicate with God. Which, by the way, if you think about it, what an image. Moses with this veil on his face most of the time. But that again suggests that Moses here has ascended not to an angel, but to some sort of being that is not who he was. Other questions, comments?
Is that documented? Is there any text about his covering his face with
Yes.
a?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't remember it offhand. Let me see if I can find it.
Thank you for calling today.
Yeah, Exodus 34. Just turn back to it, and it looks like it's verse 29. Yes. Look back at page 545 if you want to. So Moses came down from Mount Sinai. As Moses came down from the mountain bearing 2 tablets of the pact, Moses was not aware that the skin of his face was radiant, since he had spoken with God. Aaron and all the people saw that the skin of Moses' face was radiant, and they shrank from coming near him. But Moses called out to them. Aaron and the chieftains returned. Afterward, the Israelites came near, and he instructed them of all that he'd been told on Mount Sinai. And when Moses finished, he put a veil over his face. Moreover, when Moses went to the Lord to speak to him, he would leave the veil off until he came out. When he came out and told the Israelites what God had commanded, the Israelites would see how radiant his face was. Then he would put the veil back on. So that is, in some sense, a reference to, it is the reference that I'm making. Okay. Anything else? Yeah, Sandy.
So, with the, Rabbi, with the, golden calf, is it clear that they were worshiping or they were just sort of frolicking around? In other words, doesn't worship mean that you pray to somebody thinking that something's going to happen, or is there any evidence that they were actually worshiping?
Well, the question is the frolicking itself, in some sense, is, think about, the Greek God. How does one worship Dionysus, right? They drink, and this is what that God requires of them. So I don't know that worship is just prayer or bowing. This seems to be interpreted as that. We, in some ways, how do we worship God? Sometimes we feast, right? part of Pesach is eating these. Now, God is not worshipped through sexual abandon, but in other cultures, there is. I don't know this for a fact. I only know this because I read Michener's The Source many, many years ago, right? But according to Michener, and maybe he has it from somewhere, right, that there was sacred prostitution among the Canaanites, where they would go in and sleep with a woman who was a priestess, and that would somehow guarantee fertility. So I don't think it's, that's not what we would call worship. It's not what God asks us to do. And we'll come to actually, I don't think today, but right soon, we're going to come to what God asks us to do in a very pithy statement. Good. Anything else? Okay. So then Moses says, not only did you do the golden calf, but you also provoked me at Kivrot HaTa'ava, right, at this place of Kivrot HaTa'ava, and at Massa, and where is it here? I just lost my place. Well, anyway, I'll read the English. Tavara and Massa and Kivrot HaTa'ava. So these are places associated with rebellion, largely over food and water. They complain that they don't have enough to drink. They complain that the manna is boring and they're sick of it and they want meat, right? So ta'ava means appetite, right? They're not, right? So, and when the Lord sent you out from Kadesh Barnea saying, go take the possession of the land I am giving you, you flouted the command of the Lord, did not put your trust in him, did not obey him. As long as I've known you, you've been defiant. So Moses says, when I lay prostrate before the Lord those 40 days and 40 nights, because the Lord was determined to destroy you, I prayed to the Lord and said, and here now we get Moses's case. It's separated after Moses intercedes and he breaks the tablets and he grinds up the calf and the people and he throws it into the brook. O Lord God, do not annihilate your people, your very own people. Don't tell me they're my people. They're your people who you redeemed in your majesty and who you freed from Egypt with a mighty hand. Give thought to your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and pay no heed to the stubbornness of these people. So, covenant, don't forget the covenant. Yeah, they're stubborn and they're difficult, but your covenant, and then else the country from which you freed us, will say, it was because the Lord was powerless to bring them into the land that God had promised them, and because God had rejected them, that he brought them out to have them die in the wilderness. Right? Here's Moses' second argument. The first argument is, you promised. The second argument is, your reputation is at stake. If you're stuck, Moses is saying, the fact that you interceded and the fact that you brought the people out of Egypt now means that people are watching you. And they won't understand that you did this because they were wicked. They'll just say you're weak. And remember what I said a few minutes ago, that one of the reasons for the Exodus is to show that God is more powerful than all other gods. That's one of the things God wanted to accomplish. And Moses is saying to him, well, this is not going to help you. Right? So he does not say that the people are not sinful. He doesn't deny the crime, right? But he says, well, there are other things for you to consider. Right? And they are your people, your very own people, who you freed with your great might and your outstretched arm. Okay, so we're gonna, well, we can go a little bit further. I think we have just enough time. Thereupon the Lord said to me, carve out 2 tablets of stone like the first, and come up to me on the mountain and make an ark of wood. So here we get a reference to the ark. We'll find out Moses makes it of wood here, but when they actually get to the tabernacle and they build the tabernacle in the Mishkan, the wood is overlaid with gold on the outside and gold on the inside. So there's a veneer of gold outside and in. There's a wonderful rabbinic statement. Why do we need gold inside? No one can see it. And the answer is to teach us that a person should be the same outside as they are inside. It's a lovely idea. Anyway, God will inscribe the tablets of the commandments that were on your first tablets that you smashed, and will deposit them in the ark. So God's going to give them another set, God is essentially accepting that the covenant has not been irrevocably broken. And Moses said, I did that. I carved out the 2 tablets of stone, and I took the 2 tablets with me, went up the mountain. The Lord inscribed on the tablets the same text as the first. So in this telling, God wrote both tablets. He addressed him at the mountain on the fire the day of assembly, and the Lord gave them to me. And I left and went down the mountain, and I deposited the tablets in the ark that I have made, and they are still there. So Moses is saying, it was repaired. Right? The covenant was renewed, and I did get the tablets, and you can essentially see it, right? Because the ark, right, is with us. There's a lovely rabbinic tradition that you have to ask, well, what happened to the first tablets? I mean, with respect to the calf, Moses grinds it up and gets rid of it. The first tablets are simply broken. And so the Midrash says, what happened? Moses gathers up all the fragments of the first tablets, and they go into the ark along with the second tablets, the new tablet, which is very much, like the idea of you don't throw a Torah away, you don't throw a prayer book away, right? And traditionally, we bury them, but we also know that Jewish communities have sometimes preserved. So we have the very famous Geniza that was found in Cairo by Solomon Schechter, discovered there, which had hundreds and hundreds of years of Jewish sacred text, and really revolutionized our understanding of the Jewish past. There were books that had been referred to elsewhere, never seen, and so on. Right. So this idea sort of has its prototype here, with the second set of tablets being gathered up also and put into the ark. That is, however, what the rabbis say, it's nowhere here in this text. Okay, and then we're told where they went, right? That the ark, where they had gone from place to place, and then we're told about the death of Aaron. Aaron died there, was buried there, and his son Eleazar became the priest in his stead. And from there they marched to a region of running brooks, right? So it seems that Moses is able to stall off Aaron's punishment, but not entirely. Not entirely, because he will die. Every human being dies, right? But to see it in this context, right, gives us a sense of perhaps a postponement of Aaron's fate, rather than it being carried out immediately, because Moses is successful in interceding. Okay, So for the few minutes we have left, any questions? Anything at all? Yes, Sandy.
Rabbi, do the rabbis look at when Moses drew the Ten Commandments first set down? Do they look at it as anger or say righteous indignation?
I would say the latter. Right. I think I think it is righteous indignation. Let me just see what, I mean, certainly they read it that way. Let's just see. Yeah, no, here he simply says what he did and doesn't tell us what the rationale is, right? I grabbed them with my two hands and I smashed them before your eyes. But I think elsewhere we do see evidence of Moses's anger. It seems to me that when they come to the rock and they're asking for water, and Moses reacts by calling them rebels and smashing his staff, that looks like anger. Here, I would say that Moses is angry for God's sake. And I think the term righteous indignation you mentioned, I think, is exactly the right one.
Thank you.
Anything else before we go? Okay, so I wish you a good week, and hope to see you all next Tuesday.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Sure, Carol, go ahead.
Francesca,
Oh, Fritz, I can't
that's
see.
okay. That's all right. So I forgot what Aaron's punishment was. He was allowed to go into Israel, wasn't he?
No,
He wasn't.
no, Aaron doesn't make it. Moses doesn't make it.
I knew Moses didn't.
Aaron dies before Moses. Moses at least gets to go up the mountain to see the
See it.
promised land before he dies. No,
Aaron didn't make it.
Aaron doesn't get that privilege.
All right,
No.
thank you.
Only two people who make it into the promised land, Joshua and Caleb, the son of Yefuneh, do get to go in. That's it, of that whole generation. Everybody else dies out in the wilderness and they alone go in. Okay, if there are no other questions, I'll see you all next week.
Thank you very much.
Hey.